Bueno, le damos la bienvenida, vamos a esperar unos momentos. Por favor, a las que están ahí, muchas
Welcome
gracias por
everyone.
ser
Thank
puntuales.
you to everyone who has been on time. We're going to give everyone a few minutes to enter.
Muy buenos días a todos y todas.
Good
A
morning,
nombre de la Red de
everyone.
Mujeres
In the
Indígenas
name
sobre
of the
Biodiversidad en
Network of
América
Indigenous
Latina
Women
y
on
el Caribe,
Biodiversity in
le
Latin
damos la
America and the
cordial
Caribbean,
bienvenida.
we
Mi
welcome
nombre es
everyone.
Hortensia Hidalgo
My name is
Cáceres, soy del
Hortensia
pueblo
Hidalgo
Aymara del
Cárceres.
norte de
I'm from the
Chile y
Aymara
parte de
people
la
in
Red
the
de
northern
Mujeres
Chile
Indígenas
and
sobre
part of the Indigenous
Biodiversidad en
Women's
América
Network
Latina y el
on
Caribe. Y
biodiversity
le
in Latin
acompañaré
America and the Caribbean. And
moderando
I'm
esta
going to be
etapa de
moderating
estos webinars de
this
fortalecimiento
webinar,
de capacidades y
trying to
conocimiento de las
strengthen
mujeres y pueblos
capacities and
indígenas
knowledge of
rumbo a la
Indigenous women and
COP16,
youth in
actividad
on
que
the
es
roads to
apoyada por
COP16,
Land is
activity
Life
that is
y
supported
FINA.
by Land is
Les
Life and
informo que
FINA.
tenemos interpretación
We have
simultánea al inglés y el
interpretation
español.
into Spanish
Abajo,
and
ustedes
English.
encontrarán tres
Below,
puntitos al
you will
costado,
find three dots
donde encontrarán, dice más, y ahí
where it says more.
en el mapita mundi dice
And in the
traducción,
globe
porque hoy día sí
icon,
tendremos,
you can
miren, dos
access
invitados y uno
translation. We
va a
have two
hablar en inglés y la
invitees,
otra
and
en
one of the
español, si lo
invitees is
van a
going to
tener que
speak English
usar
and the other one
las que lo
Spanish,
requieren.
so you might be able to use
Este
this.
cuarto seminario en línea
This
vamos a
fourth online
discutir sobre
seminar, we are
la
going to talk
formación
about
digital de secuencias y pueblos indígenas,
sequences and
un
Indigenous
tema
peoples,
emergente,
an
importante que también se
emerging
va a
topic
tratar en la próxima COP que
that
se
is very
realiza en
important, and
Cali,
it's going
Colombia.
to be talked about in
Y
the
este
next COP, which
seminario
is
en
going to be in
línea es
Cali, Colombia. And
parte
this
de
online
5 seminarios
is part of five
del
seminars
fortalecimiento de
on
capacidades y
strengthening
conocimientos de las
capacities and
mujeres y
knowledge
pueblos
of
indígenas rumbo a la
Indigenous women and
COP16,
youth
que
towards
tienen por objetivo
COP16.
fortalecer,
The objective is
potenciar
to
e
strengthen,
incentivar el desarrollo de
nourish,
capacidades,
and
habilidades,
promote
competencias
capacities,
de los pueblos indígenas,
knowledges, and the
principalmente las
skills of
mujeres
Indigenous
y
people,
jóvenes indígenas
especially
de
in
América Latina y el
Indigenous women
Caribe,
and youth in Latin
para que
America and the
puedan
Caribbean,
aportar e
so that they
incidir
can
en las
offer and
negociaciones de la
have insight on
COP16,
the
en la
negotiations of
implementación
COP16,
y
on the
revisión de las
implementation and
estrategias
revision of
nacionales
the
sobre la
national
biodiversidad
strategies on
y planes
biodiversity
de acción del
and
Marco
action
Mundial de
plans
Biodiversidad de Kunming, Montreal, a nivel nacional,
of the summit
asegurando
that's going to
el
happen in
respeto
Montreal,
a los derechos y
ensuring
esfuerzos de los pueblos
the
indígenas
rights
en
and
la
efforts of
conservación
Indigenous
de la
peoples
biodiversidad.
towards the
Para
conservation of
comenzar,
biodiversity. In order
invitamos
to
a nuestra
begin,
hermana
we invite our sister,
Ana, quien nos va a dirigir
Anna,
la ceremonia,
who is going to
nuestra
have
hermana
an opening
Maya
ceremony.
de
Our sister
Guatemala.
is Maya
Adelante, por
from
favor, querida
Guatemala.
Ana.
Go ahead, dear Anna.
Sawata hatuntera sokak ushka
The speaker
hadulkata
is speaking
yo
Indigenous tongues.
shaqintaqe ihari masakh ihlo qabarwa hunchebek panala de la choqi de la calendario maya. Muy buenos días a todas las hermanas
Good
que
morning, all
están
the
conectadas desde los
sisters that
cuatro
are
puntos
connected
cardinales
from
del
the four
mundo,
cardinal
de
points of the
Latinoamérica,
world in Latin
Mesoamérica.
America, Mesoamerica.
Un honor poder
It is an
participar
honor to be
y
able to
ser parte de
participate and to
esta
be a part
reflexión
of
espiritual
this
desde la
reflection process, a
cosmovisión maya.
spiritual reflection on
Sabemos
the
que
Mayan
la riqueza, la
cosmovision. We know that the
diversidad, el
richness and
conocimiento, la
diversity and the
espiritualidad de
knowledge
los pueblos
and spirituality
originarios
of all the original
es
peoples
diversa,
is
enriquecedora
diverse,
y para
enriching,
ello pues vamos
and
a hacer una
thus we
reflexión
are
desde
going to
nuestras
do a
propias
reflection
cosmovisiones. En esta
from our
ocasión lo
own
vamos a hacer desde la
cosmovisions. In this
cosmovisión
case, we're
maya
going to talk about
y para ello
the
pues
Mayan
pido a
cosmovision. And
todas,
for
de
this, I
verdad, que nos
request
conectemos
everyone
espiritualmente
who is
desde los
spiritually committed
puntos energéticos que estemos
from
en
the
nuestros
energy
países.
points where we find
Hoy
ourselves in our
en el calendario
countries.
maya
Today in the Mayan
somos
calendar,
Tzi.
we have
El Nahual Tzi es
Itzi.
uno de los 20
Nahuatl
nahuales
is
en
one
el
of the 20
Choctí, que nosotros le
Nawals,
decimos
Chochti,
calendario,
which we call the
que
calendar,
personifica a dos
which
animales,
personifies two
que
animals
simboliza el
that
tepezcuintle y el cerdo.
symbolize
No
the
es
dog.
casualidad que
And
este
it's
taller de fortalecimiento de
this
capacidades pues va unido al
workshop
conocimiento,
on
a la
capacities
espiritualidad y
unites
a
spirituality
ser
and knowledge
guardianes. El perro
and the fact
significa
of
ser
being
el guardián
guardians, and
y
dogs
nosotros
are the
como mujeres,
guardians.
el
And
rol
as women,
fundamental, somos
our
guardianas,
fundamental role
protectoras,
is we are the
conservadoras, pero
guardians,
desde nuestras
protectors,
diferentes distintas
conservationists
formas
from
de
our
las
different
cosmovisiones de los
ways
pueblos
of the
originarios.
cosmovisions of original
También el
peoples.
ti dentro del calendario maya
Also, in the
significa
Mayan
la autoridad,
calendar,
la ley.
we have the animal that signifies
Dado a lo que
authority or
también
law,
estamos
given that we
esta
are
mañana
also
dando a
this morning
conocer con las capacidades de las mujeres jóvenes,
understanding the
es
capacities
que
of young
también
women,
alentamos a todas las
then we
mujeres y a
are
los
also
pueblos indígenas,
encouraging all
hombres,
women of
niños,
Indigenous
para
peoples,
que exista una
men,
igualdad de
children, to
derechos.
have
Y esa igualdad de
equal
derechos la
rights. And
podemos
this
encontrar
equal
en la
rights
autoridad que
can be found
necesitamos, la
in the
justicia,
authority
justicia para la
that
madre
requires
naturaleza,
justice,
justicia para
justice
los
towards
pueblos
Mother Earth,
indígenas,
towards
justicia
Indigenous
para la
peoples, justice
distribución justa y
towards the
equitativa de los beneficios que se
just and
derivan de la
equitable
biodiversidad. Y es
distribution
ahí
of
donde
benefits of
está el rol
biodiversity.
fundamental de
And
las
here
mujeres y
is the
pueblos
main role of
originarios.
women and original peoples
El sí,
lie.
como les decía, es
As I
la
was
autoridad,
saying,
es
this
el
animal is the
guardián.
authority,
Y
the guardian,
también para de diferentes cosmovisiones
and
es
from different
también guía para los
cosmovisions, it's
muertos. El
also
sí es
a guide
la
to the
otra
dead,
vida que nos conduce a través de
which
otros
leads
ríos, otra
us
vida
through
que
other
es para
rivers and other
renacer.
life
Y
in order to
entonces
be
con los
reborn.
permisos
And so,
de las abuelas, los
with the
abuelos,
permission of
vamos
our
a encender las
grandparents,
velas.
we are
Ustedes
going to
ven
light the
aquí
candles you can see
las
here,
velas que representan también la
the
luz,
candles
la
that also
guía,
represent
la
light and
autoridad,
guidance, authority,
la claridad, y vamos a pedir
clarity,
por la
and we're
claridad,
going
por
to
el
request for
conocimiento que
clarity
esta
on knowledge
mañana vamos
that this morning we are
a
going to
tener con
have
todas
and share
y los participantes.
with all of the
Así que
participants.
desde los 4 puntos
So
cardinales
from
vamos
the
a
four
pedirle
cardinal
también al
points, we're
Nahual
also going to
y a las
ask
abuelas y a las
Nawal,
abuelas
our
sí, que
grandparents,
nos cuiden por
to
toda
care
la
for
labor que
us,
nosotros
for
realizamos
all
en
the
nuestras
work that we
comunidades,
do
en
in
la
our
defensa de la
communities,
madre, en la defensa de los
defending the
territorios
mother,
y en la defensa de la vida misma de los
defending
pueblos
life
originarios.
itself of
Diosdi,
original
Hanah,
peoples.
Keam, Oshin, Kehampach. Gracias, hermanas y hermanos.
Thank you, brothers and sisters.
Muchas gracias, querida Ana,
Thank
por
you
esta
very much, dear
ceremonia,
Anna,
por
for
darnos
this
la
great
fuerza, la
ceremony,
energía.
for giving us
Muchas gracias.
strength and
Y para
energy. Thank you so
continuar,
much.
vamos a invitar
And
a
in order to
nuestra hermana
continue, we're
Florina
going to
López.
invite
Ella es la
our sister
coordinadora
Florina Lopez.
de la Red de
She's the
Mujeres
coordinator
Indígenas sobre
of the Indigenous
Biodiversidad de
Women's
América
Network on
Latina y el
Biodiversity,
Caribe,
Latin
para
America,
que
and
dé
the
las
Caribbean,
palabras de bienvenida.
to give
Adelante, por
the
favor,
welcome
Florina.
words. Go ahead, Florina.
Docus Nuet, ahora sí. Docus Nuet, muy buenos días,
Good
hermanos
morning,
y hermanas.
brothers and
Agradecer
sisters.
sobre todo
I
a
would like
Ana por
to
esta
thank
invocación
Anna
espiritual,
especially for
que es
this
lo que
spiritual
nos une a
invocation, which is
nuestra
what
Madre
unites us
Tierra
to our
esta
Mother Earth,
espiritualidad
the
que nos
spirituality
sirve
that
para nosotras
helps
como una fuerza,
us
como una conexión total para
to
poder
be
seguir
completely
luchando,
connected,
para
to have
poder seguir
strength, to continue
trabajando.
fighting, and
Gracias,
to
Ana.
continue working.
Y
Thank
también
you, Anna.
agradecer al
And I
equipo
would
de
also
Land is
like to thank
Life, a todos los
Land is
presentadores
Life
que
and
hasta
all the
a este tercer
presenters
webinar pues nos han
to,
apoyado, nos han dado
that have
sus
participated in this webinar
presentaciones
because
para
they've
poder
given
tener
us
un
their
contexto de todo lo que
presentations
se
in order
está
to have a better
discutiendo, de todo
context
lo
of
que se
everything
está
that we're talking
planteando y
about, of
sobre todo de
everything
todo
that
lo
we're
que
seeing, and
durante
especially
la COP16 pues
everything that
vamos
during
a estar
COP16 we
discutiendo
are going to be
y
talking about
negociando
and
con los estados
negotiating
partes. Y
with
en
the member
particular
states,
sobre este
and
tema tan
especially
importante, como
on this
decía, es un
important
tema
matter,
emergente en
which
la
is
cual
such an
pues los pueblos
emergent
indígenas
topic,
todavía estamos
where
también
Indigenous peoples are still
cómo
trying
entramos,
to
qué es
see
lo que
how we can
significa,
have
estamos
our
tratando de
voice. What does
entender
this mean?
inclusive
We're
hasta los
trying to
mismos
even
científicos
understand
del mundo occidental, igual
the
también está en
scientists of
este
the Western
proceso
world
de poder
who are also in
entender,
this
de
process
poder
of trying to
dar sus
understand
propuestas que
and to offer their
salvaguarden, que
proposals that
garanticen sus
will
derechos nosotros
safeguard
como
and
pueblos
ensure
indígenas y sobre todo
the
como
rights of
mujeres
Indigenous
indígenas
people, and
también.
especially as
Estamos en ese
Indigenous women.
proceso pues
So
para
we're in
poder
this
dar nuestra
process in
opinión,
order
nuestras
to be
propuestas,
able to offer our
para
opinions
poder
and our
entender a
proposals in
dónde
order to
también
understand
este
exactly
tiene impacto sobre nuestras
what
vidas
the
y sobre nuestras
impact is
formas
on our
de sistemas
lives
propios
and
de vida
our
y
own
nosotros
systems of
mismos
life,
como pueblos
on our
indígenas
knowledge
y
as
cómo las
Indigenous
mujeres
peoples,
estamos también en este
and
proceso
how
pues para poder
we as women are
estar
also part of this
a la
process,
par
and
con el
we
mundo
have to
occidental
be
y sobre
at
todo
the same level
a
of
nivel
the
interno, a
Western
nivel
world,
de nuestras
especially
comunidades
internally
también.
and in our
Entonces, este
communities
es
as well.
un tema muy
So this is
técnico,
a
quizás
very
lo vayan
technical
a
matter,
decir de esa manera, pero también, pues también hay
but
que estar allí
we
presente,
also
porque
have to
si no
be here and
estamos, siempre
present,
las cosas
because if
ocurren,
not,
nadie nos
things
espera. Y nosotros,
happen
por
and
tanto,
no
tenemos
one
que
waits
subir a
for
este
us.
tren que va
And so
marchando
we have to get on
rápidamente.
this train that is quickly on
Entonces,
its way.
agradecer esto
So I would
y
just
bueno,
like to
tendremos a la
thank
doctora
everyone for
Yolanda.
this.
Gracias,
And
doctora
we have
Yolanda, por su
here
tiempo.
Dr.
Sé que tiene
Yolanda.
una
Thank you so
agenda
much for your
apretada.
time. We know that you have a
Igual el
very tight
hermano
schedule,
Preston, que
as
todavía no
well
está
as
conectado,
our
pero
other
que yo
Preston,
creo
who
que
is not
está en estos
connected yet, because I
momentos
believe he is currently
en un horario diferente al de
in a
nosotros. Está
different
en
time zone.
Sudáfrica, en Johannesburgo,
He's
pero
he
él
in South
iba a
Africa, in
intentar
Johannesburg,
ingresar.
so he was going
Esperemos
to
que
try
durante estos
and enter.
minutos
Let's hope that in the
él
next
ingrese, porque
minutes
también él es
he
uno de
can come
los
in,
que
because
han
he's
dado
also one
seguimiento a este
of
tema
the
y nos
people who
van a
has
dar muchas
followed this
luces
topic,
sobre
and
esto
they can offer
justamente
a lot of light
dentro de la
on this,
COP16 es uno de
especially
los temas que se va a
because it's such
discutir.
an
Y la
important
idea
topic
es
on
de que
COP16.
desde este
And the
espacio
idea is that
demos nuestras
from this
ideas, nuestros
space, we can
puntos de
offer
vista,
our voices, our
preguntemos
perspectives, and that
también a
we
los que
ask any
manejan este
questions that we
tema
may
y
have,
poder llevar también una
so that we
propuesta
can
como
also
mujeres indígenas,
have a
como pueblos
proposal as
indígenas
Indigenous women and
este,
Indigenous
a este
peoples
espacio de negociaciones.
towards this
Entonces,
negotiation
justamente, pues
space.
estamos preparándonos para esto.
So
Muchas
we're
gracias y
preparing
bueno,
for this. Thank
que
you so
puedan
much.
aprovechar
And
estas
I
dos
hope that
horas
you can
de
make the most of the
intercambio, de
next couple of
experiencias y
hours of exchange
conocimiento.
and
Muchísimas
experiences and
gracias.
knowledge. Thank
Adelante.
you very much. Go ahead.
Muchísimas gracias, querida Florina.
Thank you so
Y
much,
como
dear
dijo Flor,
Florina. And as
tenemos
Florina said,
una gran participante, le damos
we have a
muchas
great
gracias a nuestra
participant. We would like
hermana
to thank our
Yolanda
sister,
Terán. Ella nos
Yolanda
va a hablar,
Teran.
vamos a
She is
entrar
going
ya
to
en el
talk
tema,
about
que es
the
DCI,
main
desde
topic,
la visión de los pueblos
which
indígenas, las
is
propuestas y retos
the
que tenemos
proposals and
para
challenges we have
enfrentar
as Indigenous peoples
este
in
tema.
order to face
La
this
doctora Yolanda
important
Terán
topic.
es de la
Dr.
nación
Yolanda
indígena
Teran
quichua del
is from
Ecuador,
the
nació en la
Quechua
ciudad de
peoples
San
in
Gabriel,
Ecuador. She
al
was born
norte
in
del
San
Ecuador,
Gabriel
en
and the
América
north
del
of
Sur.
Ecuador
Desde
in South America.
1934
Since 1994,
representa a pueblos indígenas de
she
América Latina y el
represents
Caribe en
Indigenous
las Naciones
peoples,
Unidas.
Latin America, and the
Ella
Caribbean
es
in the UN.
licenciada en museología de la
She has
Universidad de Río de
received
Janeiro, su maestría de
no
artes
degree
la realizó
from
en la
the Rio de
Universidad
Janeiro
en
University. She has a
Inglaterra,
Master of
tuvo su
Arts from
doctorado en la
the
Facultad de
University
Educación,
in English. She has a
Concentración
doctorate
en
degrees
lenguaje,
on concentration
alfabetización
of
y estudios
language, literacy,
socioculturales
and
en la
sociocultural
Universidad
studies
de
from the
Nuevo México.
University of New
Actualmente es
Mexico.
punto focal de la red
Currently,
de
she's
mujeres
focal
indígenas
points
por la
of Indigenous Women's
biodiversidad de
Network
América
on
Latina y del Caribe
biodiversity,
en
Latin America,
Ecuador,
and the Caribbean,
así como parte del equipo coordinador de la
as
ONU.
well as the
Adelante,
part of the
querida
coordinating
Yolanda.
team. Go ahead, dear Yolanda.
Bueno, muchas gracias. Primero
Thank
por
you so
la
much
invocación que ha hecho la
for
hermana
the
Ana.
invocation that
Viene
the sister Anna
viene
has
muy
done.
bien porque es un tema bastante
It's amazing
complicado,
because
es
it's
un
a very
tema
difficult
que
topic.
tenemos que ponerle atención, mucho cariño y
We have
tratar de
to have a
entender
lot
y
of
tratar de
effort
involucrarnos también
into
como
understanding
pueblos
it and
indígenas.
to try and
Entonces,
participate as Indigenous people.
tengo una
So I
presentación,
have a
¿hay
presentation.
autorización para
Is it all
empezar la
right if I
presentación, Elsa?
start the presentation?
Sí, adelante.
Yes, of course, go ahead.
Ya, ustedes me dicen si la ven o no y si
You
hay
tell
algún
me if
problema.
you
¿La
can
ven?
see it. You can see
Todavía
it?
no.
Not yet.
Yo ya la puse.
No, no se ve, hermana. Buenos días.
No, we
¿No se
cannot
ve?
see
Ah,
it.
ok.
No?
Vamos
Okay.
a ver, entonces, déjeme ver. Eh, Bueno, si no se ve, no importa. Yo sigo
Well, if we
hablando
can't see it,
porque
it's okay.
mi
I
tiempo
can
es
continue
cortito, por
talking
favor.
because I don't have a lot of time. I apologize.
Eh, bueno, el tema de la presentación es pueblos
So the topic
indígenas,
of the
comunidades
presentation is
locales
Indigenous
y
people, local communities,
secuencia digital de
and digital
información.
sequencing of
Em,
information.
Un momentito.
Just 1 second.
A veces la tecnología no nos
Sometimes
acompaña.
technology
Ya.
doesn't help.
Quise empezar
I wanted to start
recordándoles nuevamente lo que es
reminding
el
everyone
convenio de la
again
diversidad
about what
biológica
the
que fue abierto a la
agreement
firma
on
en
biological diversity
1992
that
y
happened
está
in
vigente desde
1992 and is
1993.
in force
Hay
since
tres objetivos que tiene
1993.
el convenio de la
There's
diversidad biológica.
three
El
objectives
primero
that
es la
this agreement
conservación de la
has, which is
biodiversidad
conservation of
para mantener su
biodiversity
riqueza.
in
El
order to
segundo
maintain
es
its
el uso
richness. The second
sostenible de
is
los
the
componentes de
sustainable
la
use
biodiversidad.
of
Y el tercero es
biodiversity
la
components. And the
participación justa
third
y equitativa
is the
en los
just and
beneficios que
equitable
se derivan de la
participation
utilización
of
de
the
los recursos
benefits
genéticos.
obtained by
De
the
esta gran convención
resources, biodiverse
debemos
resources. In this
estar
convention,
conscientes que tiene mucha
we must be
importancia para
conscious
los
that it
pueblos
is very
indígenas
important
el
for
artículo
Indigenous
8,
peoples,
inciso J, que se
especially Article
refiere a
8,
conocimientos tradicionales,
paragraph
prácticas
J,
y modificaciones, novedades.
due to
El
its
artículo 10C, que es sobre el
news
uso
and
cuidadoso del
modifications.
medio,
Article
y el
7, which
artículo
is the
15, que es sobre
consensual use,
reparto de
and
los
Article
recursos.
15, which is
Lógicamente,
sharing the
hay otros
benefits.
artículos, pero estos son
There's
los que
other
en este momento
articles,
podemos utilizar
but
cuando
these are the
estamos
ones that we're
hablando
going to currently use when we talk
indígenas.
about this convention.
Dentro del convenio de la diversidad
In the
biológica
Convention on
hay un tema
Biological
que se
Diversity,
lo llama
there's a
emergente,
topic
temas
that
emergentes del
is
convenio de la diversidad biológica.
emergent.
¿Y cuáles son estos temas? La biología
And
sintética,
what are these
los invasores
topics?
genéticos, la
Synthetic
secuencia
biology,
digital de información.
genetic drivers,
Nuestra pregunta
and
siempre como
digital
pueblos es
sequencing
¿qué
of
ventajas
information.
tenemos al
Our
utilizar esta
question as peoples
biotecnología?
is
¿Qué
always,
desventajas? ¿Cuáles
how
son
do
las
we use
amenazas y
biotechnology? What
los
are the
riesgos
advantages
están
and
conocidos
disadvantages? What
o
are the
aún
threats?
siguen
And do we know all of
desconocidos?
them, or are they still
Entonces,
unknown to
frente a
us?
estas preguntas,
So, faced with these
debemos siempre
questions,
trabajar y
we always
luchar
have
por el
to
respeto a
work
los derechos de los pueblos
on
indígenas
having
y los derechos de
the
la madre
defense of the
tierra, el
rights
derecho a la
of
consulta,
Mother
al
Earth and Indigenous
consentimiento
peoples,
libre, previo e informado.
free and prior informed
Y cuando
consent.
haya el uso de este
And
tipo
when
de
there's use of this
biotecnología,
kind of
que nos pasen una
biotechnology,
información clara
we need
y
to receive
culturalmente
clear
pertinente.
information and
Julia,
culturally pertinent
¿ahora puedes ver si
information.
tu presentación se
Now,
comparte?
can you check if you can
Ok,
share your screen, please?
ya.
Yes, of course.
Ahí se puede, a ver, déjeme ver.
One
Ahí se
second.
puede ver.
Can you see it
Ahora.
now? Not
No,
quite yet.
no, entonces algo pasa. Como les
Then
digo, no
something's
perdamos el tiempo
happening. Let's not
en
waste
la
time on
cuestión
this.
técnica. Vamos adelante, porque
Let's
yo estoy
continue.
lista con la presentación, pero
Because I'm ready with the
¿está segura que
presentation,
me dio la
but are you sure
autorización
that
para
you gave
pasar
me the
la presentación?
authorization to give the information?
Sí.
¿Sí?
Sí.
Bueno,
Yes?
seguimos, por favor.
Okay.
Entonces, yo les decía que frente
So,
a
as
este
I was saying, faced
desconocimiento
with this
de los impactos de la
lack of
biotecnología,
knowledge on the impact
entonces
of
como pueblos indígenas
biotechnology,
siempre
then as
debemos
Indigenous peoples, we must
pedir
always
y
request
asegurar el
and
respeto
make
e
sure
inclusión de los
that there's
sistemas
the
de
respect and
conocimientos
inclusion
indígenas,
of the
prácticas e
indigenous
innovación.
systems of knowledge,
También
including
tenemos que
practices and
tener a la mano
innovations. We also have to have
salvaguardias
on
y
hand
mecanismos de protección.
safeguards and
Y siempre
precautionary
trabajar por una
mechanisms, and
participación
always
plena y
work
efectiva,
towards a
incluidas las
full and
mujeres indígenas y
effective
los jóvenes.
participation,
Ahora,
including Indigenous women
estamos
and
hablando
youth.
del uso
Now we're
de
talking about the
información,
use
de
of
bases de datos.
information,
Entonces
of
también hablamos
database.
de reparto de
So we're also
beneficios
talking about
y que
sharing
sean de una manera
and
justa
reaping
y
the benefits and
equitativa
making sure
y que
they're
todo este
just and
proceso se
equitable, and
haga
that this
con
entire
mediante
process
relaciones
is
de
carried out
confianza,
throughout
de respeto
trust
mutuo y de
relationships,
transparencia.
mutual respect, and
Hay una decisión
transparency. There's a
que
decision
debemos tenerla en mente y
that we
tomarla
always
en
have to
cuenta, es la
consider,
decisión 15.9,
which
que
is
se
Decision
refiere
15.9, which
a secuencias
refers to
digitales y
digital
recursos genéticos.
sequences
Aquí,
and
pues
genetic
lógicamente, sería
resources.
importante entender
Here it's
qué es
important to
una secuencia
understand
digital y qué es
what
un
is a
recurso
digital
genético.
sequence and what is a
Eso,
genetic
pues esperemos que el
resource.
hermano
So
Preston
let's hope that Brother Preston
se una a la reunión. Él es el
can join
encargado
the
de
meeting
explicar todo
because he's
esto,
the person
pero
in
ahí
charge of
ustedes,
explaining all of
los que
this,
no
but
pueden ver, luego yo
you
puedo
can't see.
mandar el link de la
Maybe I can
decisión
send the link
15.9,
later
pero esta
on the decision
decisión nos
15.9.
habla del reparto de
But
beneficios
it talks about
considerando
the
otros
sharing of
instrumentos
benefits
y formas.
considering other instruments
Tiene
and
que
forms.
regirse a los
It
términos
has
de
to be
conservación y a los tres objetivos del
dictated by
convenio.
the conservation terms and
Habla
the
de
three
la
objectives of the
importancia de la creación y el desarrollo de
CBD
capacidad,
or the convention. It
la
talks about
transferencia
developing
de
capacities,
tecnología y la
transfer of
cooperación
technology,
científica y
and
técnica
scientific and
para apoyar la
technical
generación de
cooperation in order to
información digital
support
sobre
the creation
secuencias
of
de
digital
registros
information
genéticos,
on
el
sequences and
acceso a
genetic
ella y su
resources, the
utilización.
access to it and its
La
use.
importancia que reviste la información
The
digital sobre
importance that
secuencias de
digital
recursos
information
genéticos para el
has
marco
on
mundial de
genetic
biodiversidad
resources
común
on the
mundial
frame
y
of the
reconocer el valor de
CBD,
depositar
and
datos en
recognizing the
bases de
value of
datos
depositing
públicas.
data in public
Esta decisión
databases.
también nos
This
habla de la
decision
participación
also
justa y
talks about the
equitativa de los
participation
beneficios
that must be just and
y
equitable
dice que esta
regarding the benefits, and it says
este
that
reparto
this
debe ser eficiente,
distribution has to be
viable y
efficient,
práctico. Debe
viable,
generar
and
beneficios
practical.
monetarios
It
y no
has to
monetarios,
create
pero también
monetary
debemos
and
estar
non-monetary benefits, but
atentos
we
a los
must also be
costos.
aware of the cost.
Este sistema de reparto de beneficios
This
debe ser eficaz,
division
debe
of
proporcionar
benefits must be
seguridad y claridad
effective. It has
jurídica
to offer
tanto a los
security
proveedores
and
como a los usuarios de
legal
información digital
safety
sobre
to
secuencias de
providers and
recursos genéticos
users
y
of
no
this
debe
information on
obstaculizar
genetic
la
resources and
investigación y
digital
la
sequence,
innovación.
and it
Debe
shouldn't
ser coherente con
create a
el acceso
barrier to
abierto a los
innovation
datos. Mientras
and
estoy pasando la
technology. It has to
información
be
que está en esta
open to the
decisión,
data. This is the
porque cada uno
information
de
that is
estos
in
puntos ha
Decision
sido
59
discutido
because
por
each of
más de
these
2
points has
años
been
y en
discussed
los
for the
cuales un
last two
grupo
years,
pequeño de pueblos
and a small
indígenas ha
group of
participado,
Indigenous people has
a veces,
participated,
digamos, con nuestra voz y a
sometimes,
veces solamente como observadores.
sometimes with our voice and
Debe ser
sometimes only
compatible con
with
otras
our
obligaciones
presence.
jurídicas
It has to be
internacionales
compatible with
y debe
other
apoyarse también mutuamente con
jur-
otros instrumentos de acceso y
legal
participación
decisions,
en los
and it
beneficios.
also has to be
Aquí viene
related to
algo
the
que es
benefits
nuevo
of
y que
other
lo
conventions.
debemos
Here's
tomar
something
en
that's
cuenta,
new and we have to
tener en
consider.
cuenta
It says that we
los
should
derechos de los
consider
pueblos indígenas
the rights of
y las
Indigenous
comunidades
people
locales,
and local
incluidos
communities,
con
including
respecto a los conocimientos tradicionales
traditional
asociados a los
knowledge
recursos genéticos que
associated to
poseemos.
genetic resources that they
Hay que
possess.
reconocer que los
We must
beneficios monetarios y
recognize
no
that the
monetarios
monetary and non-monetary
también se los debe
benefits
utilizar para apoyar a la
should
conservación y
also
el
be
uso
used to
sostenible de
support
la diversidad
conservation and
biológica
sustainable use
y
of
debe
biological
beneficiar
diversity,
a los pueblos
and it must
indígenas,
benefit
comunidades
Indigenous
locales,
peoples, local
mujeres y
communities,
jóvenes.
women, and youth.
Cuando hablamos del nuevo marco
When we
global,
talk about the
tenemos
new global biodiversity
este tema de las secuencias
framework,
digitales tiene que ver
this
con el
situation
objetivo
on
C.
digital sequence has to do
El
with
objetivo
Objective
C,
C.
no lo voy a leer todo,
I'm
pero
not
se
going to read the
refiere a que
entirety
los
of it,
beneficios monetarios y no
but it talks
monetarios
about
derivados de la
monetary and
utilización de los
non-monetary
recursos
benefits
genéticos y
derived
de la
from genetic
información sobre
resources
secuencias
and
digitales,
information on digital
así como de los
sequence,
conocimientos
as well as
tradicionales
traditional
asociados a los
knowledge
recursos genéticos,
associated
se
to genetic
compartan de manera
resources,
justa
and
y
they must be
equitativa.
shared in a just and
También tiene que
equitable
ver con
manner.
la meta
It
13,
also is
que
related
dice
to Goal
tomar medidas
13, which
jurídicas,
talks about
políticas,
taking legal
administrativas y de
measures in
creación de
terms of
capacidad a todos los
policies and
niveles
creating
según proceda.
capacities on all levels.
Ahora, ustedes dirán, ¿por qué los
Now,
pueblos indígenas
you'll
ahora
say
están
why
involucrados
Indigenous
en
people
estas
are now
discusiones de
involved in
secuencias
these
digitales y de
discussions in terms of
biotecnología?
genetic
En
sequences and
otros
biotechnology.
webinars se
In
les
other
ha pasado la
webinars,
información a ustedes de que
we
dentro
offered
del Convenio de la
information
Diversidad
that
Biológica
inside the
hay
Convention on
más
Biological
de casi
Diversity,
20
there's
temas
more
diferentes
than 20
que se están
different
llevando a
topics
cabo,
that
se
are
están
being carried
discutiendo.
out, that are being
Entonces,
discussed.
uno de estos temas
And
era
so
la
one of
secuencia
these
digital.
topics
¿Qué
is
pasó en el año
digital
2020?
sequence. What happened in
Simplemente a los
2020?
pueblos indígenas nos sacaron de la mesa de
We
discusión
were
porque
removed
pensaron
from
los pueblos
the
indígenas no
round
tienen nada
table
que
because they
decir
thought that
en
Indigenous
cuanto
people have nothing
a
to say
secuencias
regarding
digitales.
digital
Entonces,
sequence.
alarmados
And
con esta
so,
situación que nos parecía
concerned
un
about the
poco
situation,
democrática,
which we thought was
nos
very
reunimos un grupo de
undemocratic, we
personas
gathered a
bajo el
small group of
liderazgo de
people
Preston
under the
Harrison
leadership of
y
Preston
diferentes
Harrison
personas de
and
otros
other
continentes,
people
personas
from different
indígenas, hermanos y
continents and
hermanas
Indigenous
indígenas,
people, brothers
que
and
nos pusimos
sisters.
a pensar, a
And
ver,
we all
¿qué
started to
podemos
think,
hacer?
okay, what can we
Y
do?
empezamos a hacer como
And we started
una lluvia de ideas.
brainstorming.
¿Cuál es el significado
What
cultural
is
de
the
un gen
cultural
para los pueblos
significance of a
indígenas?
gene
¿Qué
to Indigenous
significa,
people?
y si ese gen está
And if
dentro
this
de una
gene
secuencia?
is
¿Qué
inside a
significa eso
sequence,
para
what does
nosotros?
this
Y
mean
desde ese
to
punto de vista,
us?
entonces,
And on that standpoint,
recogimos mucha
we gathered a
bibliografía,
lot
muchos
of
libros, nos
bibliography, a lot of
dividimos el
books.
trabajo y
We
luego
divided the
elaboramos
work,
un
and
documento de
then we created
posicionamiento
a
de
document, a
pueblos indígenas como
statement
foro
of Indigenous
indígena
people
sobre
as
este
Indigenous
tema.
Forum on
Entonces,
this
yo no
matter.
voy a leer todo el
So I'm
documento
not
porque
going
está
to
muy
read the
largo.
entire document because it is
Asimismo,
quite long.
en mi presentación está
In my
el link
presentation,
donde
we
ustedes
have the
pueden
link
encontrar este
where you
documento
can
que yo
find this
creo que cada uno
document
de nosotros
that I believe
deberíamos
each of
tenerlos,
us
pero sí el
should have.
documento lo que dice es los
But what the
pueblos
document
indígenas
says is that
generalmente
Indigenous
ven
people
el mundo
usually
vivo
see the
y la
world
naturaleza, incluidos los genes,
alive,
como
including
sagrados.
nature and genes,
Entonces dice,
as
como
sacred.
información derivada del
So,
material
as
genético,
information
la
derived on genetic
información de
material,
secuencia
the
digital
information on
debe
digital
etiquetarse con
sequence
mayor
must be
precisión
tagged
como
with greater
información de secuencia
precision
genética
as
digital y
information
debe ser
on
respetada como un regalo de la
digital
Madre Tierra.
sequence, and it has to be respected
Hay
as a
otro
gift from Mother
fragmento que
Earth.
dice, esta visión
There's another one that
relación
says, this
distinta
vision
debe
of the
tener
world,
en cuenta esos de ética,
I apologize, but
práctica
I am not receiving
de diversidad
audio.
de las tecnologías. En virtud de la Declaración de las
In
Naciones
virtue
Unidas
of
sobre
the
los derechos de
Declaration of
los
the
pueblos
UN on
indígenas y el
the
Protocolo de
rights
Nagoya,
of Indigenous
los
people and
pueblos
the
indígenas
Protocol of
tienen derecho a
Nagoya, the
controlar
Indigenous people
el
have a
acceso a
right
sus
to
conocimientos
control
tradicionales y
the
recursos
access to their
genéticos
traditional
que incluye
knowledges
la
and
secuencia
genetic
digital y que
resources,
requiere su
including
conocimiento
digital
libre,
sequence, and
previo
that
e informado.
requires its free, previous, and informed
Em,
consent.
También en nuestro documento de posicionamiento, nosotros pusimos algunos
In our
pensamientos de
statement,
autores
we also
indígenas
put
y
a few
básicamente yo aquí
statements and
en mi presentación tengo
declarations on
un
Indigenous
pensamiento largo,
authors, and here I
extenso
have a
sobre
very
la
long quote
consideración cultural del
on the
maíz.
cultural
Les voy a
consideration
leer
of
un
corn. I'm
pedacito
going to
donde
read a
dice,
small
la
excerpt
relación de los
where it
pueblos con
says
el
the
maíz
relationship
es
of the
especialmente
Indigenous
notable.
people with corn
Para la
is
gente del
very
pueblo, el
notable for the
maíz es un
people.
sacramento,
It is
es una
a
representación,
sacrament.
una
It's a
encarnación de la esencia de
representation,
la vida de la
an
Madre Tierra.
incarnation of
El
life
maíz
and
no
Mother
solo
Earth.
es un alimento, sino
It's not
también es
just
una entidad
food, it's
simbólica
also a
que
symbolic
acuna toda la
entity
psicología
that
y
gathers
la
all of the
orientación
psychology and
espiritual del pueblo.
spiritual
¿Por qué
orientation of
pusimos
a
esto?
peoples.
Ahí
Why did
está
we add this?
la manera
Here
como nosotros
is the way
defendimos
in which
nuestra
we defended
participación plena
our
y efectiva en
participation
el grupo de secuencias digitales.
in the digital sequence
Ahora,
group.
¿qué pasa frente a los diferentes
What
enfoques, a
happens with the
opciones y
different
modalidades de política?
treatments and
Entonces, debemos
approaches in
tomar en
terms
cuenta
of
que
policy
este
measures?
tema de
We have
secuencias
to
digitales
understand
es un tema del convenio
that
de la
digital
diversidad
sequence
biológica y del
is part
protocolo de
of the
Nagoya y
Convention on
también
Biological
del artículo
Diversity and the
31
Protocol
de la
of Nagoya, as well
Declaración
as
de
Article
los
31
Derechos de los Pueblos
of the
Indígenas.
Declaration of Indigenous Peoples'
Recordar
Rights.
que dentro del marco mundial,
We have
pues
to
el tema
remember
de la
that inside the
biosfera
global
se está
biodiversity framework,
tomando en cuenta en el objetivo C,
we
en
have
la
to
meta
consider
13
Objective
y en
C
todas
in
las
Goal
otras metas
13 and in all
relacionadas con el
other goals
acceso y la
related to
participación de
access and
beneficios.
participation of
El
benefit.
CBD debe reconocer
The
el
CBD
papel de los
must
pueblos
recognize
indígenas,
the
en
role of
particular
Indigenous peoples,
de las mujeres y
especially
los
of
conocimientos
women
tradicionales
and
en cuanto
traditional
a diversidad
knowledge in
biológica
terms
y a la
of
secuencia digital, y
biological
reconocer el
diversity and
vínculo
digital sequence,
integral
and
entre
recognize
los
the
conocimientos
integral bond
tradicionales
between
y la
traditional
secuencia
knowledge
digital.
and digital
Es
sequence.
importante también
It's
tomar en
important
cuenta
as
que
well
los
to
conocimientos
consider
tradicionales son
the traditional
transmitidos por las
knowledge
mujeres
because they
indígenas
are
de
transferred
generación
by
en
Indigenous
generación
women
a los
from
jóvenes,
generation
incluida la
to Indigenous
información
youth,
sobre
including
secuencia
the
digital
information
y
on digital
biodiversidad.
sequence and
Ahora,
biodiversity.
como les
Now,
había dicho, hubieron
As I said before, we've had over 2 years of discussions and meetings in both virtual and sometimes in very strange hours where the member states that are carrying out these meetings, they have a few meeting points and sometimes they have a lot of differences. Among the meeting points or points in common, they say that there should be a just and equitable distribution or division of benefits. And they also say that that the role of Indigenous peoples and local communities must be recognized. They also talk about legal security for both users and providers of information. It talks about an open access. This has created a lot of discussion and debate. And then it also talks about the need to build capacity for all interested stakeholders. And here I would like to remember the words of Sister Iwa of Panama, where we were in another webinar where she said that we must start by understanding what a genetic resource is and what digital sequences is. What is sharing the benefits? What does that mean? What kind of percentage and why? First, we have to completely understand what we are talking about in order to participate. And that's true. And so here I invite you to leave fear aside and let's start participating little by little. We don't all know everything, but between each other, we can support each other. And as a team, we are carrying on the negotiations and different dialogues. Now, we have a lot of challenges as Indigenous peoples faced with the new global biodiversity framework and all emergent topics. We have to work on securing the inclusion of Indigenous peoples' rights and the rights of Mother Earth, to ensure the holding of the land, territories, and waters, to find the rational use of natural resources, the implementation of intercultural policies in order to tend to the real needs of Indigenous peoples in a holistic manner, to preserve Mother Earth, to care for it with respect and reciprocity of its generosity. The lack of knowledge of biotechnology of Mother Earth and Indigenous rights is a matter of great concern. We need training on biotechnology. We have to try and understand what this means and what it's all about. We talk about transferring technology. How are we going to do this? If we talk about a manner that is culturally responsible, what does this mean and how do we do it? Now, in order to work on this, we need sustainable funding for capacity building, which has to happen on all levels with several social actors. And it's also important that we have the proper translation when we're working on these topics. Our aspiration is to always have a direct funding and to have a full and effective participation. When we work on these new topics, we always have to include Indigenous peoples. We have to consider the consultation and prior and informed consent processes, the work on Indigenous languages, and in the proper time frames. We always talk about full and effective participation. What does this mean? What mechanism can we offer or propose? We also talk about safeguarding and precautionary measures. What are they? As far as I understand, one could be the declaration of the UN, and others we can properly create in the field and on the way. We have to create alliances with partners. And we always have to create relationships based on understanding, mutual trust, and understanding. Now, the recovery of biodiversity is everyone's responsibility. It is a collective work. During negotiations and meetings that we've had, I've always talked about databases. We're talking about software. We're talking about something that many times Indigenous peoples don't have, but we do have a different kind of knowledge, our own knowledge of life, our millenary and old time knowledge that always applies to this kind of discussion. What we've been hearing is the application of CARE principles, C-A-R-E, which means collective benefits, authority to control,
de FAIR, que significa que se puede encontrar, accesible, interoperable y se puede reutilizar.
Interoperable, and that can be reused. But as Latin America, We even said this in Montreal. It would be important to bring back the OCAP system of the First Nations because it is a system that allows them to control the processes of information gathering in their communities. The First Nations are owners. They protect and control the information and they know how to use it. And the access to the First Nations data is also important. And so on the same at the same time, we must also consider the what we've been able to work with in the HJ working group, which are the guidelines on voluntary work, on traditional knowledge, etc. What do we expect? We hope that the multilateral organizations and offer a multi-organization and multilateral participation as well as an equitable participation on the use derived from digital information on genetic sources and sequences to create non-monetary benefits that can help to close the gaps, both scientific, technical, and technological, in the way that we access and use digital sequence on genetic resources in the world. We hope that the multilateral entity also offers transfer of technology, mobilizing new funds and resources towards the conservation of biodiversity. It would also be important to have an indicator on DSI, for instance, on the legal framework on DSI. And of course, our aspiration, our hope is to have a full and effective participation, just and equitable in this entire process. And to include in all of this analysis and in all of this dialogue, these conversations, brothers and sisters that are already working on this, on working on DSI in universities or laboratories or whatever it is. We also hope to have the participation of youth and women, and we must work together. We must work as a team, trying to understand each other as a unit. We have a lot of challenges. Are we going to need funds to travel? Will we have the visa? Will we have a hotel? Will we have a good internet connection? So we have to solve all of this, but it's also important to have knowledge, to be informed, to go to the group that has been working on this and request more clarity and guidance, and let's work together in Cali. We have a lot of challenges coming up. There's a lot of questions. How are we going to participate in the implementation of the goals and objectives of the Global Biodiversity Framework? How are we going to work together to have a more humane world? We have to try and make sure that we include free, prior, and informed consent and to always know the roles that we are going to carry out in this process. Our aspiration is to be in meetings where there's respect and inclusion. We must also consider and not forget that the realities of our peoples are completely different. While in some there might be internet and electricity, etc., there are others that even being developed countries, they still have indigenous peoples that don't have the necessary technology or internet connection, and we have to consider all of this as well. So here, unfortunately, we also have to recognize that we are forcibly going towards a transition from oral words and conversations to written language, and we have to understand new languages. It's important for young people in the region to start learning and speaking English. What we have to do in terms of our governments is to do lobby, to go to the representatives that are working with DSI and ask them if there's a legal framework and how are they considering indigenous peoples? How are they considering our participation? What does that look like? What's the background for the training on DSI? Are they understanding what this means? what it means to have full and effective participation of local communities, indigenous peoples, especially women and youth. Also, when we approach our governments, we have to ask them if there's going to be a group of delegates of indigenous people towards the government. This is important to know so that we can also have their support. So I believe that with all of this information, all of these ideas, and with all this information, we can have a full and effective participation in the COP Cali. In conclusion, I would like to say that the Indigenous Forum, the RMAs, recognize the contribution of modern science to the sustainable use of biodiversity, including genetic resources. But we need to build multicultural dialogues and intergenerational dialogues in order to meet and better implement this new global biodiversity framework, understand emergent topics, and to also have work towards respecting Mother Earth's rights. What I would also like to say, and this is the topic that Brother Preston is going to talk about, we have to have a full and effective participation of indigenous peoples, local communities, indigenous women and youth in the entire process of DSI. I mean governance, the sharing of benefits, monetary and non-monetary, transfer of technology, etc. We have a long road ahead of us because all of these challenges are very clear to Brother Preston, who is leading this group. In order to close, I would like to thank all the brothers and sisters who initially started this process: Preston, Paulina, Aun, Jean, Hamal, Jennifer, Jasenia, and myself. Thank you so much.
Muchísimas gracias, querida Yolanda.
Thank you so much, dear Yolanda. We would like to thank you for giving all of this information. And sometimes it is very unclear, so thank you so much. There will be new space for questions, and we are now going to give the floor to Brother Preston Artisan with the matter of the negotiation process of DSI, its challenges and advancements. He is an political analyst with biology of conservation and a focus on behavior ecology. Since 1990s, he has concentrated his work on biodiversity, the rights of indigenous peoples, as well as he has been named, as Yolanda said, the negotiator of rights for indigenous people in the Convention on Biological Diversity since 1996. In the OMPI, the World Organization of Intellectual Property, as well as other entities. Thank you. Go ahead, Preston.
Recuerden que podemos cambiar ahora la traducción porque nuestro hermano se va a hablar en inglés.
Please remember that he's going to speak in English, and so we have to access translation.
Okay. Hola, ¿qué tal? I am sorry, discúlpeme, no es posible hablar en español porque mi español es muy malo. Muy degradado. So I will speak in English. I'm sorry I'm late. I got the time wrong. I thought it was in half an hour from now. And we're in the middle of a meeting, and you'll just be happy to know what I was scribbling on a board right before I came in was that in this fund, at least for the first 2 years, I'm proposing that all of the money for a global biodiversity fund goes to indigenous peoples and local communities. So we will cross our fingers. This is just a discussion session. We can't say that's going to be how it's going to work. But I will then now go into to the DSI discussion. And I don't know if you can run it from your end. I'm happy to share my screen, but I will try to do that. But I have.
Sí, por favor, adelante.
But, oh, you can do that? You can run it, or should I run it from my end? Okay, good. I think okay. Let me then get my other presentation up. Okay, so are you seeing my English version? So hopefully you're seeing Just in
in
Espanol.
Spanish.
Okay, that's good. That's good because I have mine and I will run mine and ask you to change that's in English and then ask you to change the slides. Okay, so I am very sorry this is going to be a lot of information, but I've tried to keep it very simple. And these are going to probably be very new ideas to many of you. They are a little bit different than the conversations that we've had over genetic resources, because as I will show you, digital sequence information is not the same thing as genetic resources. And the declaration talks about genetic resources, but digital sequences are different. Okay, so next slide. Second slide. Should I?
It's already second slide.
Okay, I can advance. Okay. So just as a background, the Convention on Biological Diversity was developed in 1992. It came into force when enough countries signed it and ratified it in 1993. It had a longer history, but initially it was just a straightforward Western-style biodiversity conservation treaty. But in 1988, there was a very famous report called the Brundtland Report that suggested this concept of sustainable development, that people should be into the picture. And so they added human beings to the conservation story. And they created 3 different principles for this treaty. And the first one is that it should be based on conservation of biological diversity. It should be based on the sustainable use of biodiversity by human beings, and that there should be benefit sharing for that use of biodiversity. So those 3 core principles still run, it's core to all of the decisions of the CBD, including the digital one on digital sequence information. I won't go much into this second slide, but I will say at the time that this treaty was created, genetic resources are considered part of the global public domain, that nobody owned them and that anybody can use them for free. And developing countries said this is unfair. And indigenous peoples also said this is unfair. You're taking our genetic resources and you're using them and making money on them, and you're not asking our permission. You're not, asking if the use, even if you're not making money, if the use of it is acceptable to us. And this is called biopiracy. And biopiracy was characterized by the lack of consent, the lack of sharing benefits. And indigenous peoples said, we want to have control over the uses of our genetic resources. We also want to have control of our traditional knowledge and that is related to these genetic resources. And so that was the big debate at the time. So this was the very first treaty that started to deal with the issue of biopiracy, and also then changed the ownership of genetic resources from being in the global public domain, where anybody can use it for free without asking any permission, to being part of the national sovereignty framework, which meant that nation states now own genetic resources. In the initial convention, indigenous peoples were not seen to be owners of traditional knowledge, of genetic resources, although they were seen to be the owners of traditional knowledge. Okay, so understand that when the CBD got passed, it has a definition of certain things, and these definitions have to be taken seriously, because you cannot define genetic resources any way you want to, because when a country signs a treaty, it is a very solemn act. And when they say we agree to be bound by the conditions of this treaty, they're only bound by exactly what they agree to. If there are other things that aren't in the treaty, they're not bound by it. So no sovereign gives up their sovereign rights. This is the same for indigenous peoples. You don't give up your sovereign rights without your free prior and informed consent, and it has to be explicit. So genetic resources have a particular definition. It is genetic material of actual or potential value. And then they define genetic material, which is any material of plant, animal, microbial, or other origin containing functional units of heredity. Now, that's a lot of words, a lot of Western words, but what that really means is genetic resources are a sample, like a plant or a seed, or even just an organ of an animal. It doesn't have to be the whole animal or the whole plant. It can be a leaf. And that leaf will contain genes and contain genetic material. So when you take a sample containing genes, which again, it's not directly about the genes, it's your right to own things that are on your territory. It's again, it's very geographically oriented, in which case you only own those genetic materials that occur on your territories. Now, again, I want to emphasize in the initial convention, there's no mention that Indigenous peoples own genetic resources. They do not own genetic material. And I'll get to a treaty where that was changed a little bit. So now it is recognized that you may own genetic resources, but I'll get to that in a second. But then there's also a definition of what's called utilization of genetic resources. It doesn't define it. The Nagoya Protocol did define that the genetic resources also applied to the biochemical composition of plants, animals, fungi, all species. Okay. Now, then we also, of course, have, let's see, that's the same one. All right. We also have Article 31 of the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. And Article 31 says Indigenous peoples have the right to control access to their traditional knowledge and genetic resources. So it says, unlike the convention, it says that you have a right to control access to your genetic resources. Now, genetic resources aren't defined in UNDRIP, but understand that the definition then has to come from the Convention on Biological Diversity, because that's the only thing at the time that defined what genetic resources are. So that the Declaration has the same understanding and definition of genetic resources as the CBD. Now, the CBD, Convention on Biological Diversity, has Article 8J. I hope you are aware of this. You need to study this. And so it does say that all the parties to this convention must preserve, maintain knowledge, innovations, and practices. So again, the focus is on the knowledge that is relevant for the sustainable use of biological diversity, and also to promote the wider application of the knowledge with the involvement of the owners of that and the equitable sharing of benefits arising from their use or utilization. So here's a little picture of what the situation was at the time. Here's the model. The model in everybody's heads was that somebody would come illegally onto your territory and take your genetic resources without your permission, and that they would also maybe acquire your traditional knowledge by talking to an elder, talking to a traditional knowledge holder, to a shaman. And then they could also maybe get the traditional knowledge from books, because much of it had already been, or at least some of it had already been shared with anthropologists in the past, when people didn't have an idea of these issues, of the risks and dangers involved. So in that model, what happens is you have Indigenous peoples who have their own conceptions of what genetic materials are, because again, Indigenous peoples do not think of them as resources, as Yolanda pointed out with the corn. They're sacred, they're kin, they're relatives, they're relations, they have relations with you. In many cases, many indigenous peoples believe that they have their own nations. And where I worked for many years in the Pacific Northwest of the US, we called the salmon peoples because they are their own nations and peoples. However, non-indigenous peoples tend to think of them as resources in a very material and material way, which is their right. So the idea is that a biological sample is collected. It goes to a research institution. It may go to a laboratory, a university. It may go to a corporation, and the corporation then may develop things from it for monetary, for making money. The universities may not make money off of it. They may. Some universities do make money off of genetic resources, but at least they use it for research. And not all of it's bad, not all of it's evil. There's many uses that are quite good. They use it for conservation purposes and for protecting the environment and so on, and developing drugs that help people get healthy and heal and so on. And so let's go to the next slide. So here's the model again, that we changed that in something called the Nagoya Protocol, because again, the problem with the Convention on Biological Diversity is it really didn't, even though it said you should do these things, it really did not have a lot of detail on how you should do it, and what the principles were. So what they needed to do was develop another instrument. So they created another treaty. So Nagoya Protocol is also a treaty. And remember that a treaty is a binding instrument. It's legally binding. And that makes a very big difference because the parties are legally binding themselves to enact the principles of that treaty. So in this model, and I'm sorry for that photo, I needed to generate a free-to-use photo, so I used one of the AI programs, and this will just give you a hint of what artificial intelligence thinks an indigenous person looks like, and you can see it's quite kind of offensive. But the idea is in Nagoya was that it would run by bilateral contracts. So the model is somebody wants to get access to your genetic resources. They come to the front door of your territory. Then they knock on the door and they say, "Can I get access?" Well, then they have to get your consent. And that instrument is called prior informed consent. Of course, for indigenous peoples, we say free prior and informed consent. And they come up with an agreement, and then indigenous peoples and, of course, local communities embodying a traditional lifestyle also get to set the terms on which you can use those genetic resources. So the model was we develop a contract, just like any kind of legal contract in the Western world. And indigenous peoples can specify you can use it for this and this and this, but you can't use it for that. And that's because you own that sample, you own that genetic resource that came from your territory. And in that model, they envisioned that the companies would take it into their own laboratories to a single company, and it would all the work would be done internally within that company. And then they would develop a product, and you would agree to what benefits and what controls you had over that development process. So again, it was very good because it meant that the indigenous peoples have a lot of control over what happens to the genetic resource. It's a one-on-one negotiation that's based on, again, free, prior, and informed consent and mutually agreed terms in order to get access to the traditional knowledge. And again, depending on the jurisdiction, you might have rights to genetic resources or you might not. So in the CBD and the Nagoya Protocol, indigenous peoples always own their traditional knowledge. So that's secure. You own your traditional knowledge. And anybody using your traditional knowledge has to get permission. In Nagoya Protocol, however, in Article 6, it says that genetic resources, you might own them if the nation state in which you live recognizes your ownership. But if it does not recognize your ownership, the Nagoya Protocol does not recognize your ownership. So, anybody could probably, take it even from your own territory. Now, the other thing that we developed in the Nagoya Protocol through the work of the IAFB was the idea of biocultural or cultural protocols. And so the way biocultural protocols is you have your own customs and traditions, and you can internally develop your own rules saying, should you want to use our knowledge or should you want to use our genetic resources? Here's what our customs are, and you have to follow our customs. So that these protocols can be used in these agreements, and in a way, they allow you to use to make sure that your customs are not violated or transgressed when people do research, because they're bound by the contract that they signed. And then Nagoya encourages benefits to biodiversity, but it's not required. The main goal of Nagoya was to get access to traditional knowledge and to genetic resources. And that was what they wanted. They felt like the use of that would be what they really wanted to do. And if somebody wanted to, if you agreed, I'll take $10,000 for that, that was okay. And so but the problem is at the collection stage, even though your knowledge and genetic resources may be valuable, you don't really know it at the time that it's collected. You only know its value after a lot of research has been done. So for example, of genetic resource, whenever a successful product is developed from genetic resources, usually only about 1 in 10,000 samples result in something that's useful. So certainly using traditional knowledge and with Indigenous peoples, having knowledge about the uses of genetic resources, it increased the odds. So it was, much less than 1 in 10,000, but it's still not a sure thing because it's very difficult to develop a product that goes to market. So that means that, even if it results in a $1 billion drug to heal some disease, you don't know that until the end of the research process. So what often happens when you sign a contract, you get a small upfront payment or you get some benefit that you want at the beginning, but you may not get much more than that because, again, nothing may come out of it. It's very hard to measure the benefits that have actually been shared through the access and benefit sharing system developed by Nagoya. The Access and Benefit Sharing Clearinghouse has over 4,000 ABS contracts that are mentioned, but most of those, over 3,000, come from India. So the problem has been that Nagoya has not, even though it was hoped that this would release a lot of benefit sharing and that Indigenous peoples would get a lot of benefits for their knowledge and for access to their genetic resources when they had that right, it just hasn't materialized, and that's a problem. So again, traditional knowledge is protected anywhere. Genetic resources may be protected. And there's another problem that, of course, we know, especially for settler states, the ones where you had Indigenous peoples and then the colonists came in. It's very clear you had an ancestral domain that you traditionally occupied. Those traditional domains have now been shrunk quite a bit for most Indigenous peoples. And so the current territory that you're on is the one where you have the legal rights within your nations. But most nations don't really recognize many rights in your ancestral domain. They may recognize some rights, like rights to have ceremonies and visit your cultural sites. They may even protect some of your cultural sites. But in general, in terms of genetic resources, they do not recognize your rights to genetic resources outside of your current territory. And that's a big problem, but that's not really something that we can solve. That's a national issue. The CBD does not cover that, and that's a real problem and limitation. So, but the reality is right now, the rights you have to genetic resources are mostly in most countries limited to your territory. So this is just, and understand that the samples are relatively easy to control just because, somebody has to come onto your territory, and usually there's enough people, using your territory that will notice if there are strangers there collecting things. But, they can't always. People can sneak in and still take things. But in terms of control, it has a fairly high, there's a fairly good way to control access to those genetic resources. But and there's also another thing you need to understand is that if people are going to get a patent on something, they're not really patenting the genes themselves. There's a few nations that do recognize patents on genes, but usually patents are limited to something novel, non-obvious, and inventive, which means you have to do something, a gene is a naturally occurring thing, and you have to do something new with it what you patent is that new thing. You don't actually patent the gene itself. So that means that wild biodiversity, crops and breeding, that wild biodiversity is not really patentable. Now, there may be a different regime for crops and breeds under the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations. There's a different regime for human genes because humans have particular human rights that most nations do not believe exist for wild species. Of course, indigenous peoples do, but in Western law, there's really a very significant difference in the legal regime applying to human genes. Now, there's also the problem of data sovereignty. We heard earlier about the care principles, which talks about collective ownership and the right to control access to genetic resources, the responsibility to respect indigenous values and cultures, and so on. But again, that right to data sovereignty, if you only applies to the territory itself. So if you generate data, there are more and more indigenous peoples who've gone to university and they're actually doing genetic research. And if you are generating data on your territory, you have full control over that data. But it doesn't mean that you control research off of your territory. So, for example, if you have a species that you consider sacred and somebody collects it off of your territory, in most jurisdictions, there's nothing you can do about that because and they can do whatever the research they want to on that species. So, for example, we know all the conflicts over things like research on the genetic resources of ayahuasca and the different components of ayahuasca and so on. Okay. Okay, so now I'm going to get to digital sequence itself. And the problem with you own the genetic resource, but the problem is, first of all, that when you get actually down to the gene level, you can't really own genes or gene sequences. And I'll show you a picture that hopefully makes this a little more understandable. Because those gene sequences that are held within any one species, first of all, not all the sequences are unique. Some of them are shared widely with other species, and I'll show you a graphic on that. Second of all, species disperse. Birds fly, fish swim. And that creates a really big difficulty because if a species naturally migrates out of your territory and somebody collects it outside of your territory, that's not biopiracy. Because biopiracy is strictly about them coming onto your lands and taking a sample. And so there are also trillions and trillions of small gene sequences already out there. They already are in the databases because this research on digital sequence information has not been regulated up to this point. And there are huge numbers that are out there. And also remember, the CBD said anything that was collected before 1993, when the treaty came into force, is in the public domain, because again, the treaty had not been signed, and they do not, take in treaties, you do not have something called retrospectivity or retroactivity. It's a fancy word. It just means you can't apply it to things that happened in the past. So even though there are now rules in place to protect some of your rights now, if these things were taken in the past before the CBD was signed or before Nagoya was signed, there's really nothing you can do about it in a legal sense. And I'll talk a little bit about some moral and ethical and other issues that you could use. Okay, so understand that this is a kind of a picture of a chromosome. And to the right side is a diagram of the structure of that chromosome. And you can see that there's these twisted little bands that looks like kind of like a ladder that's been twisted into what's called a helix. And there are these little bars, and those bars are what are called nucleotides. And don't worry about the words. You don't need to memorize these, but it is really significant because there's some aspects of this structure that I'll demonstrate that it makes it really hard for you to control. Okay, so here's a drawing of a chromosome. If you unravel it, it's just this double helix, and then there are these little, you can see these little bars here that are called nucleotides. Now, even though life is very, very diverse, incredibly diverse, it's actually made up, again, this is a simplification, but I'm just going to talk about something called DNA, which is a specific molecule for heredity. And it's only made up of 4 nucleotides. And these nucleotides are actually paired. So here's a nucleotide called adenine. Here's one called thymine. And adenine and thymine pair together into what's called a base pair. So if you think about these as rungs on a ladder, there's actually only 2 kinds of rungs, 2 kinds of base pairs, so that the entirety of the diversity of life is created out of these 2 base pairs that are repeated in many, many, many different kinds of sequences. And that's what's called a genetic sequence. But initially, this genetic sequence is a physical thing. So DNA is a molecule. And it's a physical thing. But what you can do is what the nucleotides are and say, see, here's adenine. It begins with an A. You can assign the letter A to any time adenine occurs, letter T when thymine occurs, and so on. So biologists have given them abstract representations, A, T, C, and G. If you look at what this looks like when you've sequenced a gene, it looks like this. What you're looking at is digital sequence information. And the thing is, this is not physical. It's just a list of letters in, many, many different sequences. But however, each of these letters represents a physical thing. So it is the exact representation of an actual molecule. When you see G, it means the physical molecule of guanine. Now, this is what I said before about the sharing of genes. So any one species actually shares a huge number of these genetic sequences, these base pairs, with many other species. So humans, and this holds for any species, but I'm just going to show you humans. Humans are 99%, 8% of their genes are exactly like chimpanzees, particularly bonobos, a particular kind of chimpanzee. 80% of their genes are the exact same genes that you can find in bears. 40% of their genes, 60% of their genes are the same genes you can find in salmon. 40% are the same genes you can find in insects. And one of my favorite statistics is about 1/4 of your genes are the same genes you find in wine grapes. So there's a real problem, first of all, in that if you claimed ownership over all of these genes, you would be having very expansive claims because you would say, oh, I also, just because this species occurs in my territory, I also, am owning chimpanzee genes and bear genes and salmon genes. So that's the first thing, is that some of these genes you really can't claim ownership because they're so widely shared and widely spread around the world. They're not unique between species. The unique genes are actually a really, really small proportion of the genome. Actually, some species have only one gene difference between them. So one gene can affect development. It can affect the regulation of growth, the regulation of the development of organs, and it can make a difference that creates different species. So actually, even though there's a wide diversity in the world, there's, the unique sequences in any one species on your lands is going to be very, very small. And again, I've covered this. The problem, if you start trying to claim ownership when species move out of your territories, remember, species also move onto your territories from some other sovereign's territory, from your nation state's territory. There's also a big problem of what you do for species like, say you have migratory birds that start in Chile or Argentina and go and migrate all the way to Canada. Who owns those species? Because the bird is flying and landing in countries all along the way. And currently, nation states say, well, it's mine when it's on my territory, in my country, but if it leaves my country, it's no longer mine. So it's just wherever you collect it, again, it's a very geographic regime. It belongs and is owned by those from where the species are collected. So again, here's a diagram that shows that. The problem of claiming ownership over genes is not simply that these base pairs are so commonly shared widely. It's also that they're moving in and out of your territory, and that creates real legal problems of, who owns it. If you start claiming ownership over the base pairs at the gene sequence level, then others will start doing the same thing. You're sovereign, so your nation state could claim the same thing. What happens when Colombia's on the national territories, when those species move onto your territories, they would say, well, those are ours. You have to get permission for us. Where's our benefit sharing? So the natural gene flow creates real problems over claiming ownership. So again, genetic resources are on your territory. Nobody can collect them without your permission, but they move in and out, and claiming ownership over a particular sequence becomes really difficult. So again, as I said, the lands that have been ceded or stolen or otherwise occupied by others are now under a different jurisdiction than your jurisdiction, even though they're your ancestral domain. Again, you can work nationally to try to get recognition of rights in those ancestral domains, and some nation states recognize that, but the CBD does not regulate that. That's a domestic internal matter. Okay. So that was the situation that we had going into COP15 when we were negotiating the global biodiversity framework. Some people had since we had a meeting in Cancun in 2016 when these discussions first started on the digital sequences. And what the parties had said, well, we have, some benefit sharing for genetic resources, but there are also these companies using these sequences at the gene level, and there's no regime for sharing benefits. So we had to come up with some ideas about what we could do, because the parties were saying, well, we think that's a use of genetic resources. There was a lot of discussion. At the end of the day, they decided, no, it is not a use of genetic resources, but it is, and this is probably going to be difficult to understand in Spanish, it's a utilization of genetic resources. There's a legal difference between the two. And even though these letters that you saw, these GATC, they're not a physical thing. They're not a genetic resource, but they said, no, but you're still utilizing that genetic resources when you turn it into these digital sequences. And therefore, under this convention, you need to share benefits. This is a very difficult decision to get made. There were many countries that really opposed having this on here, but at the end, it went through, and many people were surprised, but we got a decision. Now, what we got was a decision 15.9. So you should look up 15.9. There's a Spanish version from the CBD. You should read that and understand we are bound by that decision. The other thing is that decision is not a treaty. It's not the Nagoya Protocol. So it's not, there's some legal status to it, but it's also not a binding treaty. Some status comes because it's a decision made under the CBD to which countries have signed on to, have ratified, but it's not formally a treaty. So it means it becomes very difficult to bind countries to the decision. There's some challenges in that. And there may be some binding aspects, but a lot of it will be voluntary. It's almost a set of best practice. You think of it more as best practices rather than a binding treaty. Okay, so we have Nagoya in place. You have all these gene sequences that are very difficult to control and that you really can't claim property rights over. And neither can the nation states. It's difficult for them too. So they said in these conditions, we want to share benefits. And that created, they needed to sort out several things. First of all, Nagoya still holds. It is a legal treaty. It's in place in many nation states. There are requirements to Indigenous peoples and local communities in Nagoya. So that there's a difficult relationship between that and these sequences that are not owned by anybody. But the model is that our model is that because that Nagoya Protocol exists, and we also very much push the declaration, but remember the declaration itself is not a treaty, so it's not itself binding, but we say, despite what the CBD says, that, remember Nagoya said you might own it if your nation state recognizes it, whereas the declaration says you own those genetic resources. Our position is you own those genetic resources, and you really have to get free, prior, and informed consent before it can be digitized. And for any sample that you have on your lands, they have to get consent. And again, for any traditional knowledge, they always have to get consent. Then if they do get consent, then those they need to get explicit consent to put it into a public database. And so they've created these databases of sequences, and they have trillions and trillions of sequences in them. And right now, researchers can go to these and they're open access, most of them. Some companies keep private databases, but there are also many, many public databases that anybody can get into and download the data. So we've said, well, first of all, you need to get permission from Indigenous peoples from any genetic resource taken from their lands and territories. If you get that permission, it gets put into one of these databases, but then you are also required to share benefits. And so the model is that in order to share benefits, money will be collected somehow, and I'm at a meeting right now, and we're discussing all of this, of how that money will be raised. And then the money that is raised from researchers or pharmaceutical companies and so on gets put in a global fund called the Global Multilateral Benefit Sharing Mechanism. And then those funds get distributed as projects. And so we have this little model you can see here shows the different categories. So the flow we see is first you have to get permission before you can even put it into one of these public databases. If you do put it in one of these public databases, you have to share benefits. So the money goes to a global fund. It may actually go nationally as well to some national funds, but those funds have to be spent on projects that benefit biodiversity and benefit sustainable use. So the conservation and sustainable use of biological diversity. Now, we have said the majority of these funds should go to Indigenous peoples. And that's actually throughout most of the negotiations of this decision. It said that Indigenous peoples and local communities would be the primary beneficiaries. The word primary disappeared at the very end and of the negotiations. And but right now, we actually are in pretty good place because most of the countries that we're talking to here and most of the discussions we've had in the many, many meetings we've had since COP15 in the last 2 years, most countries are actually still thinking Indigenous peoples and local communities should be the main beneficiaries. We don't know what percentage of the funds that will be. So what this would do is set up a general globalized fund. The fund would go, a large chunk of it would go to Indigenous peoples and local communities. We have also argued that Indigenous peoples and local communities should participate in the governance of those funds so that they help decide how those funds should be spent and distributed. So what the difference between this global fund and Nagoya is Nagoya in its bilateral means that if you have genetic resources on your territory and you have a negotiation with a company and create a contract, then all the benefits would go to you. In this model, the benefits they don't come directly back to you. But again, remember, these are gene sequences that you don't really control, but they recognize that you had a role in conserving them and maintaining them, and that they also understand now that Indigenous peoples, in order for the Convention on Biological Diversity to be successful, it must be with the participation and partnership with Indigenous peoples and local communities, because Indigenous peoples can serve 1/3 to about 40% of the biodiversity in the world. So they understand you are some of the major conservators of biodiversity. And so they've said, we know you need the most help. And so what we're doing now is having some discussions on kind of framing the decision that will happen at COP16. And we're trying to decide how much of the fund will go to Indigenous peoples. Right now, I'm arguing for at least the first 2 years that should be only to Indigenous peoples and local communities. That's where we're at right now. So I'm going to take a slide and just I'll go to this next slide and I'll take a slight break and ask for some questions, and then I'll finish the rest of this. Understand that we are also bound by this decision 15.9, which is why you need to study it and understand that the decisions we make in October have to conform to this decision that was made 2 years ago. So there are some constraints. For example, one of the decisions is we cannot interfere with research. And that's kind of a problem because many of the things that we ask for, they consider to be interfering with research. But it also says that it must respect the rights of Indigenous peoples and local communities. It's essentially a human rights and rights-based decision. So there are some things we can get done, but again, at the end of the day, we can't, we're not going to be able to ask for example, of being able to stand over the shoulders of the researchers and make sure that they abide by lots and lots of rules. So we're giving up what's called those, remember in Nagoya, I said you had the right to prior informed consent based on what's called mutually agreed terms. So that's where the biocultural protocols came in, the cultural protocols where you say, here's our rules, and you're contracting with us. Well, once the sequences enter these databases, you will not get that kind of detailed control. And I'm sorry to say that, but that's not something that is even on the table at this point. So I'm gonna stop here. Yeah, I'll stop here and see if there's any questions. And I know this is a whole lot, so I'm sorry about that, but
Muchísimas gracias, estimado Presto.
Thank you so much, dear Preston. Let's see if we have any questions. I'm sure that there's a lot of questions. And we would also like to thank everyone who's connected from Latin America, in the islands, Africa, and different places of indigenous territories of the world. Thank you so much to everyone who is connected. Valeria, can you ask your question, please?
Un saludo desde Rapa Nui para todos.
Hello from Rapa Nui, from Chile to everyone. And Preston, I have a question for you. In the 60s, when we did the airport in Rapa Nui, a Canadian doctor who came for leprosy that was here, he found a fungus that currently has been patented by Canada. Chile doesn't have the ratification of the Nagoya Treaty, and that medication is called rapamycina because they recognize that the only place where they obtained this fungus is a volcano in Rapa Nui. Currently, it's worth around 13 million pesos, and it's an immunoconcryptor, which helps for transplant situations. In Chile, there's only 2 people that have access to this medication. How could we currently find an agreement so that Chile could have better access or full access, because we have so many people who are sick, as well as Rapa Nui, having access to develop more, because there must be so many other plants help, but we have the issue that we don't have the Nagoya Treaty. So how could we potentially find an agreement with them? Because I don't think that they can say no due to a greater good. That's it. Thank you. And a big hug to everyone here. Thank you.
A ver si tenemos otra pregunta por ahí.
Maybe we have another question here. I don't think so. So Preston, go ahead.
Well, that's again, well, as I said, that's a very difficult situation because legally you can't do anything about it. Because in 1960, the convention was not signed. It hadn't been ratified, and before, remember, genetic resources were considered the common heritage of humankind. They were in the public domain. Nobody controlled them. That's a legal, again, this is the legal story. And also, if you're not ratified, if you have not, your country, if Chile has not ratified the convention or Nagoya, so if they've ratified I'm pretty sure Chile's ratified the convention, but I don't know if there's only 146 or so nations that have ratified. So Nagoya, which is a lot actually, but it's not universal. If Chile has not ratified that, then technically it's not bound by Nagoya. You're only, again, any sovereign is only bound by the agreements they've signed, that they've agreed to be bound by, and you're not. Just as an aside, for example, we often cite ILO 169, which we should. I'm not saying we shouldn't, but technically ILO 169, I think, has 23 or 27 ratifying countries, and it only applies to them. But it's important to bring it up to those countries and say, well, if you've ratified it, then when you go to the CBD, you were bound by what you agreed to. So there's a lot of Latin American countries that have signed it. So you find first of all, find some instruments like ILO, and if Chile is I don't know if Chile is a member of ILO, but if they are and they ratified ILO 169, then say, well, yeah, you have obligations, and work that way. So remember also the way treaties work, they're not what's called self-implementing. So it's not like you pass a law at the international level and immediately everybody is bound to do something, precisely do something or not do something. What happens is they're really doing what's called soft law. They say, well, you need to do this. You can't escape doing this, but you can do it in many ways, and in your own country, you find the way to do it in your own country, but you have to pass enabling legislation in your own country. Until you have domestic law, it's not in force, because the UN's not going to send in blue helmets to enforce your rights. You have to, so still, even with a treaty, there's a lot of work that you have to do domestically, and do that work. So unfortunately, again, there's also moral persuasion to persuade them. So there are things you can do, manifestations and so on, and initiatives to try to get them to do that. Now, what we are talking about in this global fund, there's something, for example, called non-monetary benefit sharing. So the way the fund works is, first of all, it's providing funds, but it's not giving money to somebody just to do whatever they want to with it. The model is mostly, the funds are based on projects. You have to do projects with this money, and the projects have to be related to biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. And we're working through that mechanism and saying, well, maybe there's some things that we can do for example, one form of non-monetary benefit sharing is repatriation. So, or sharing of medicines. So, making sure that medicines are free or accessible to certain populations. So, for example, to Indigenous peoples, if you have a drug, even if you developed it in the 60s. Now, on the patent issue, remember, a patent only lasts for 20 years. It's not like you get a permanent control or patent over something. And so if it was a patent developed a long time ago, then at this point, nobody controls that. So you could have access to the underlying patent and you can start producing that drug in Chile. So that there's that avenue to explore as well.
Muchas gracias, Presto. Efectivamente, en Chile se
Thank
ratificó el
you
convenio
so much.
169
Yes,
de la OIT,
Chile has
y
ratified
hoy aún estamos a la espera.
the
Veamos si hay otra pregunta por ahí.
ILO 169. Let's see if we have any other questions.
Adelante, Wilson.
Go ahead, Wilson.
Good, Thank you. Thank you. My name is Wilson Kazi from Kenya. I come from Ndorais Indigenous community, and I want to thank Professor for the long discussion and teaching he has given us on CBD and biological enzymes that are within territories. My question, Professor, is about some biological enzymes that was stolen from Lake Bogoria, biodiversity, as you say, from Lake Bogoria in the 1980s. And they were vaporized or they were converted into industrial chemicals by some companies in America. Unfortunately, the Nagoya Protocol came later after they had taken the enzyme. And these were through, they were taken through a university in UK who came to do research in Lake Bogoria. You must be aware about it, on the Tamu enzymes. Yeah, and unfortunately, it's a company in Netherlands which wanted to pay royalties because they on a moral obligation to help the community, at least to because they are benefiting from the resources, the enzymes. Unfortunately, something went wrong because some people or the government wanted to take over, and when the money was brought in, the government used the money, and therefore I think the company decided to withhold the percentage, the royalties that were coming to the community. Now, how do we engage with these companies directly so that they can be able to deal with communities rather than dealing with government? Because that's a challenge. And another one is how can we have a moral, as you said, moral obligation from those Chenenko and other companies that are benefiting from those enzymes to support the communities that are originated the enzymes. Is it possible through the moral obligation, as you have said? Thank you.
Yeah, and so that's a very interesting question. We are trying to work on that. So first of all, we are using kind of moral rights to. So the thing about moral rights, they're kind of in between legal and voluntary. And in some jurisdictions, you can have a moral right that's a legal right. We've argued, for example, that with this issue of ancestral domain, that maybe, and in a way, a voluntary regime might even be better for us than a treaty. Because, many companies now have what are called corporate social responsibilities, or CSR. There's also ESG, environment, social, and governance. So many corporations now are adopting these ethical guidelines or that they follow. The reason they follow them is because they know if they get into a biopiracy conflict, that costs them in terms of their reputation. And it actually can cause trouble with their investors because, if you get into a conflict, then often investors will stop investing. It costs you money, it costs you time, you have to pay for lawyers, and they really would like to keep their reputations. And so more and more companies now are starting to do it, although unfortunately in some places like my country, the United States, it's going backwards, I hate to say. But in Europe and many other countries, depending on the jurisdiction, it's still very strong. And we're working, we actually have established now what we call the Royal Dialogue. About 3 months ago, Indigenous peoples met with business, and we decided to create an ongoing dialogue. Now, the thing about a dialogue, we're not committing anything on behalf of Indigenous peoples. All Indigenous peoples have the right to make their sovereign decisions. You have self-determination. So we're not forcing anything on anybody. But we figured that maybe we should have more conversations with the companies. And, because they might, because they want to have a good reputation. They also want to make sure that they don't get involved in these legal battles. And so they want what's called legal certainty. That's a big consideration for them. So they're willing to talk with us. and they may be willing to do things that countries may not. So, for example, we now have the in the Roymont dialogue, we have, and this isn't every company right now. We've just gotten some really big companies like Sygenta, the International Chamber of Commerce, of which, most of the commercial companies using DSI are members of. So these are big players, have said, for example, we will not collect genetic resources from your territories. That's a big deal because remember what I said about Nagoya, even though the declaration says those are yours, that's not what Nagoya says. Nagoya says it may be yours if the country in which you live recognizes those as yours. But now we have companies saying we won't collect from your lands. Um, so you need to let them know. In terms of the molecules that were stolen, chemicals, I don't know. It sounds like it happened long ago enough. You probably won't be able to recover that. But again, we're talking maybe some substantial monies. And this is the other thing is we're not really sure right now how much money will go into the fund. But we do know, one, that the fund will still have Indigenous peoples as major beneficiaries. So most of the funds will actually go to Indigenous peoples, or at least a good chunk of them. And right now we're arguing for the first 2 years. I've argued 100% should go to Indigenous peoples and local communities while we decide if any others get the money, and we have to have a process for that. But I'm thinking at the end of the day, and I don't know what the final percentage would be, but it could be 60%, it could be 80%, it could be 40%. But regardless, it could be a very sizable amount of money for which all Indigenous peoples will have access. Now, we've also in the fund, we've talked about our governance, our participation in governance, and we've said this fund has to get to all Indigenous peoples. It won't, of course, get evenly to everybody, but we're really aware that the funding needs to go to rural Indigenous peoples, maybe not isolated, but certainly, very, very distant rural Indigenous peoples. And we want it to go fairly because we also know a history of where some Indigenous peoples who have people like me working with them, I can write grants, I can, get them money. We have an unfair advantage over those that can't. So we're putting into place some principles that say, we need to build your capacity. We're also working on what's called direct funding. So, right now, many of these funds, they will put the funds through one or sometimes many intermediary organizations. And we're saying, no, we think it should go directly to Indigenous peoples and local communities or to those intermediary organizations that they choose. And that can be their own organizations. Maybe they choose a non-Indigenous organization, but that should be their choice. And again, eventually what we want to do is build everybody's capacity so that they can receive these funds and do projects that restore biodiversity, conserve it, restore it. But we also want projects that restore traditional knowledge and recover it or protect it. And what we're telling them is the funding shouldn't be so narrow that it's only for restoration projects, that what you need to do is to protect the entire Indigenous knowledge system and the Indigenous cultural system, because it's the whole system that does the conservation. So if you want biodiversity in the future, you want Indigenous peoples to continue to conserve, you really have to fund a whole lot of different activities that are not strictly, directly conservation, territorial defense, territorial demarcation, monitoring, things like that.
Thanks, Professor. You have answered my question. Thank you so much.
Okay.
Muchas gracias, Presto. Y ahora tenemos a María
Thank you
Eugenia,
so
por
much,
favor.
Preston. And now we have Maria Eugenia. Go ahead.
Sí,
Yes.
muchas gracias.
Thank you so much.
Saludar a
I
Preston
wanted
y
to say hello to
también a
Preston
la
and
hermana
also
Yolanda por todo
Sister
el
Yolanda
compartimiento de sus
for all the
conocimientos.
sharing of their
Un gran
knowledge.
saludo, Preston, desde la
So thank
distancia.
you. And I send you a big hug
En
from
este
far
debate
away.
sobre
In this debate
tema de
on
secuencia digital,
the matter of
el
digital
tema de recursos
sequence, the matter
genéticos,
of genetic resources,
también viene a la mente de
it also
cómo
comes
es
to
que,
mind
por
on
ejemplo,
how
en los otros instrumentos, y voy a
on the other
referirme también en el que
instruments,
participa el hermano Preston,
and I'm also
por
going to
ejemplo, la
talk about the one
OAIPO,
that Brother
que hace
Preston is a part of, like
referencia al
the
tema de la fuente de origen de los
IAPO,
conocimientos
which talks about the
tradicionales.
source of traditional
Entonces,
knowledge.
la fuente de
And so the source
conocimiento
of knowledge
tiene que ver con todo lo que
has
es
to
la
do with
titularidad de los
everything that
conocimientos tradicionales.
is the
Y
ownership of traditional
obviamente
knowledge. And of
ahí los
course,
pueblos indígenas estamos pues
the
como los
different
titulares de los conocimientos
indigenous peoples are
tradicionales
the
porque
owners
son
of traditional knowledge
conocimientos
because
que,
these are
bueno,
knowledges, or
vienen
this is
de
wisdom
larga data, ¿no?
that
Entonces,
is quite ancient.
el gran debate que se abre
So the
en
big
estos
debate that
espacios
we
es
have in these
precisamente
spaces
la cuestión de los
is precisely
recursos
the matter of
genéticos.
genetic resources.
Disculpa, Claudia Marina, por favor, si
I'm
puedes
sorry,
apagar
Claudia,
tu
Marina, could you
micrófono.
please close your mic?
Gracias.
Thank you.
Muchos recursos
Many of
genéticos
the genetic
no están en
resources
nuestros territorios.
are not in our
Y
territory.
obviamente la
And of
vigencia de
course,
los tratados es desde el momento de la firma.
the treaties starts to
Entonces,
be enforced
pues
once they are signed and ratified.
la
So
cuestión de
I think the matter of
la patentización o la cuestión, digamos,
patents
de la
or
titularidad de los
the
conocimientos
ownership of
tradicionales,
traditional knowledge,
conocimientos que
these are
son una
knowledge, this is
práctica
knowledge that
diaria de los
is
pueblos
a daily
indígenas.
practice of indigenous people,
Conocimientos que hacen de la vida de los
knowledge
pueblos indígenas,
that actually
desde
make
lo que es la
indigenous people's
producción, desde nuestra
lives,
forma de
from our
pensar, desde nuestra
production to the way
forma
that
de
we
actuar,
think, to the
desde
way
las
that we
prácticas
act,
culturales,
any kind of
todas las
cultural
creencias,
practice,
todo
all of
lo
our
que
belief
es la
systems,
alimentación, la
and everything that has to
producción, la
do with
reproducción
food
de los animales,
production, reproduction
es
of
parte
animals.
de nuestra
It's all
práctica,
part
de
of our
nuestra vida,
practices, of
y
our
eso
life.
conlleva conocimientos
And this
tradicionales.
also means applying traditional
Entonces,
knowledge.
bien
So
decías que el tema
you were
de
saying that
cómo preservar los
how
conocimientos
we
o
can
cómo
preserve this
fortalecer estos
knowledge or how we
conocimientos
can
tradicionales,
re-strengthen this
porque los
additional
pueblos
knowledge
a
because
diario tenemos
indigenous
como
peoples
procesos,
daily
yo siempre
have
llamo
different
procesos de
processes.
sanación con la
I call them
biodiversidad,
healing processes with
a través de los
biodiversity
cantos, la
through
música, el
singing
tejido,
and
las
music,
prácticas
weaving,
culturales.
the cultural
Y es que en
practices.
ese sentido, pero
And in that
también
sense,
muy bien ligado al tema de gobiernos
it's
tradicionales,
also
al tema de
associated to
gobiernos
traditional
al tema de
governments
participación de mujeres
and
indígenas
the
en estos
participation of
gobiernos,
indigenous women in
gobiernos
this
propios.
government.
Entonces, la necesidad de
So the
trabajar
need to work
en el fortalecimiento de los
on
conocimientos
strengthening traditional
indígenas,
knowledge and indigenous knowledge,
el fortalecimiento, la
strengthening
recuperación de estos
and the
conocimientos, por
recovery of
ejemplo, en
this
las plantas
knowledge.
medicinales.
For
Cuando
instance,
sabemos
in
que muchas
medicinal
plantas
plants, when we know that
medicinales pues
many medicinal
son
plants
parte de lo que es todo
are
lo que viene las farmacias, ¿verdad? La
are
medicina
found in
occidental.
pharmacies, right? In Western
Sin
pharmacies.
embargo, en
However,
algunos pueblos con
in some
fuerte
areas,
vigencia de sus autoridades originarias,
with a strong
¿no?
presence of their
Pues
originary
se alimentan, nos
governments,
alimentamos de lo que son las plantas
we
medicinales, nos
feed
curamos la
from
alimentación
the
diaria,
medicinal
la dieta
plants. This is
diaria
how we heal
es
ourselves, and
en
it's part
base
of
a lo
our
que son nuestros
food
productos
and it's the
tradicionales y
basis of our
productivos.
traditional
Entonces,
products.
¿cómo
So
fortalecer? Y
how
entonces,
can
yo
we strengthen
pienso
that? And
que
so I'm
también
thinking
en
that
cuanto a los repartos de
in
beneficios,
terms
¿verdad?
of everything that has to do
Debe ir
with
al
sharing
fortalecimiento
benefits,
de
it
estos
also has to
conocimientos.
go to
¿Necesitamos
strengthening
información? Sí,
these
necesitamos
knowledge.
información.
We need
¿Necesitamos
information? Of course, we need
capacitación? Sí,
information. Do we
necesitamos
need
capacitación, pero
capacity building?
también
Yes, of
necesitamos
course. But we
fortalecer
also need
aquello que
to
se nos está
strengthen
yendo
what
por todo
is
lo que es
leaving
el
us
cambio
due to everything
climático.
that
Los
has to do
fondos
with
directos
climate
también
change.
deben ir a
Direct funds
fortalecer
should
esa
also
investigación
strengthen
para pueblos
this
indígenas
research
basado
that is
en lo
focused
que es
on
cómo
Indigenous people based
recuperamos,
on
cómo
how to
desempolvamos
recover,
aquello que pues se está
how we
yendo por
can
tema del
regain
cambio
everything that we're
climático,
losing due
la
to climate
migración, el
change,
racismo, todos esos
migration,
problemas
racism, all of these issues that we know so well. Thank you so much, Brother
Gracias,
Preston.
María Eugenia. Adelante,
Thank you, Maria
Preston.
Eugenia. Go ahead,
Ya
Preston.
estamos casi
We're
finalizando, pero
almost
gracias. Es
finishing.
un tema que importa
It's
muchísimo.
I could stay
very
a little
important to
longer.
maintain.
I'm happy to stay a
Muchas
little longer
gracias.
if people need it. Yes, well, first of all, there's the issue of the ownership and the need for consent, for free, prior, and informed consent for access and use of the traditional knowledge. And again, I say, I know it's not being implemented. But the principles are there, the agreement is there. So the Convention on Biological Diversity itself says you own your traditional knowledge. No matter where they encounter it, you own it. That's yours, and they need your consent to use it to do the research. So and the Nagoya reinforces that. So in terms of the access to that, the second thing is we've always brought up the spiritual aspects of this. Again, we point out this issue of the ancestral domain. We brought it up many times. It's one of the things we always say, whether they listen or not, they're kind of hard of listening and sometimes. And so, but we try to tell them that, well, first of all, these are your kin and they're related to you by lineage. They're part of your kinship system. They're part of they're your relatives. And this distinction between, physical and information and data, that's not a kind of distinction that most Indigenous peoples make. That they believe that, again, if something's developed from your lineage, from your heritage, that you're still linked to it. So even though these gene sequences are highly repeated, and even though they're shared widely, they're still part of your lineage. Now, that's a cultural issue. There's not much legally we can do with that, but we can use the moral message for that part of, well, you need to do something about it. One of the things, for example, we've suggested is maybe we could create a sacred species list. Again, not of all your sacred species. You don't want to reveal everything. But we've suggested, well, what if we create a symbolic list where every 7 sociocultural regions each get to select, say, 15 species. And these species could be put on a no research, no go list. And then you could also, and these would, in my mind, these would be species that are well known, like maca, sangre de Dios, ayahuasca. And it wouldn't be the kind of species you're still trying to keep secret. And the reason to do this is not really that it's going to protect everything, but if you created one of these lists, it's kind of like the living heritage list that UNESCO has. It would give you a vehicle to talk about your sacred values and your spiritual values. And you could have events, and you could have, UNESCO would probably get involved, and all sorts of, processes could then start kind of emphasizing these sacred and spiritual connections that you have to these things. And so I see you could create a list of some, it would just be a few. You couldn't have a lot. But I've argued that, out of the 10 to 20 million species on Earth, it wouldn't be a big deal to say these 120 species, keep your hands off. Don't touch them. We've also gotten agreement through this informal agreement by the businesses that they won't collect on sacred lands. Now, of course, that's a little difficult because they need to know where those are. If they're not going to collect there, in some sacred lands you don't want to talk about, but there's some that are known. Some parts of your territories or ancient territories are often well known. So that's on the use side. But on the benefit sharing side, we've also, again, that's what we're doing with the fund. We're saying a large part of the fund needs to be to recover and restore traditional knowledge and to make sure that it's, help living. So, for example, I read one recent case where there were some women that started doing some demonstrations for ecotourism, and the money that they raise, they put back into maintaining traditional gardens. And so by actually teaching some of their traditions, and again, they've had these discussions and decided, well, these are things we don't mind sharing. But by doing that, they're helping to raise some money to do what they really want to do, which is to get the children back into working in traditional gardens and relearning all of the traditional plants, because there's some, many indigenous peoples are starting to lose that knowledge, and the youth and the children are falling away. We also are talking about making sure that women, youth, and children are also beneficiaries of these funds. That we need to have processes for all the members of indigenous and communities and local communities, because it's they're all involved in this, and they all need to relearn and recover their roles in biodiversity conservation and sustainable use. So that's a big part of the work will be through defining the criteria for funding. And again, we've gotten, at least in the draft decision, we already have it where we get a representative of each of the 7 sociocultural regions. It will just be one, so it'll be hard to get gender balance and all of that. But over time, we can, ensure that gender balance is maintained. Not always the same people are on that committee, but we can get Indigenous representatives in the governance and also in deciding how these funds get allocated. And we can make sure that the criteria include things that allow you to recover and protect your traditional knowledge. That's a critical part. We know that COVID has done a really sad impact on Indigenous peoples and taken out so many elders. We know climate change is doing that. The other thing is there's other dimensions of the Convention on Biological Diversity that you can also start concentrating on. So we've said that benefit sharing alone isn't going to save you, okay? Because it's kind of like going to the doctor. If you have to spend more and more and more of your money on doctors, all the benefit sharing in the world isn't really going to help you if the environment, climate change is just eroding the environment. And so if you don't stop climate change, then, you can throw a lot of money at recovering your culture, but it's still, if the impacts are worth more than what you do to recover your culture, then you're still going to continue losing it. So we're really working hard also to say you need to stop perverse subsidies. You need to stop, doing things that impact Indigenous people's lands, that they didn't create the problem. You're creating the problem for them. The need for benefit sharing was really not created by them. The problem is pushed onto Indigenous peoples because of what others are doing to them. If you were in your own lands and you weren't molested by climate change and development projects and pollution and so on, then you wouldn't really need benefit sharing. You could just live your lives. So it's just this is one of the weirdnesses of this system. But we are focusing on what we can do to keep traditional knowledge alive on the ground, keep your institutions, all of your customs, all the culture alive on the ground. And that's, again, that would be criteria for funding of these projects. And again, if we get direct funding, we're also saying Indigenous peoples need to lead. We don't want projects pushed onto us by NGOs and others and governments. We want Indigenous peoples to lead in deciding what those projects will be and what's best for them for biodiversity and sustainable use.
Muchas gracias, Presto.
Thank you so much, Preston, for clearing up so many doubts. And I'm sure we will have many, many more in the future regarding this topic, because it's a topic that really affects Indigenous peoples on a daily basis. And thank you so much for the amazing work that you do for caring for Indigenous peoples and defending our rights. I don't think we have any more questions. And so we thank you again. Thank you for your time. We know that you're very, very busy. And we would also like to thank the interpreter. And before we finish, I would like to give the floor to the co-coordinator of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity for Latin America and the Caribbean, Ramiro Vaccine, to give us the final words for this activity. And in the meantime, let's all open our cameras and get a family photo. Go ahead, Ramiro. Thank you, Hortensia. It's a pleasure to say hello and to see the faces of Indigenous women network on biodiversity, promoting these dialogues that are so important. I would like to congratulate the network and each of you that is part of the network, because to have this dialogue process towards COP is vital. We know that this is one of the main topics to treat in the COP. And as was said, I would also like to congratulate Preston and Dr. Yolanda that have been working these matters, which are the emergent topics and the new topics that we say that really we have to learn on about. Preston, I'm always amazed at everything that you present. It's such a two-way process. One, to really inform us on the matter. And this is important to ask the network to continue these processes, these capacity building processes, especially regarding these matters on genetic resources and digital sequence. Today, Preston clears up a lot of matters and actually gives us a lot of information. And the other thing is to create a process that also defends our rights. These are important matters to us. What Dr. Yolanda was saying was also relevant, how we're going to prepare and how we're going to face the COP and the challenges that we have. And I think that this is all very important. And it's important to strengthen all of these negotiations so that we can have a participation. And we also want to promote the participation of young people so that they can also obtain this information and they can start having their own capacity building, as was Dr. Yolanda was saying, in the labs, in our universities, in our daily life. This is very important. So I want to thank everyone and congratulate all of the speakers. It shows what the Indigenous Women's Biodiversity Network is developing, and they always have our full support. So thank you to everyone who also is connected and for participating, who's interested in this matter. And as Preston says, continue reading the documents that he is giving us, because these are going to be key documents to analyze towards COP16 and in the implementation of the framework in Montreal. So thank you, everyone. Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Ramiro. He's the co-coordinator of the International Indigenous Forum on Biodiversity. So now I want everyone to open their camera so that we can get a family photo. Thank you again, Dr. Yolanda Teran, who had to leave. She's part of the Indigenous Women's Network on biodiversity for Latin America and the Caribbean, and she has followed through with all this process, as well as Preston. Thank you so much for your time. To everyone here who's present in this call from all of the spaces in Latin America, and some brothers and sisters from other regions as well. Thank you again for being here. And we will let you know that the next webinar that we have, this is the fourth webinar, the fifth, before COP, will happen soon. And those who are not going in the COP can also implement and participate and collaborate with all of these matters in your own countries and locally. So now we're going to get the family photo.
Una sonrisa.
Por favor, sonríen.
Big smiles, yes.
Así que muchísimas gracias y hasta la próxima.
Thank you so much and see you next time. Thank you, everyone.
Buena hora. Muchísimas gracias. Un excelente webinar.
This was an amazing webinar. Thank you so much.